welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Bilingualism and Multilingualism. I am Dr. Ark Verma from the Department of Cognitive Sciences at IIT Kanpur. This is the second week of the course and we are sort of moving to the second lecture. Now, you might remember that in the previous lecture we were talking about categorical perception and the ability to perceive phonemic contrasts across different languages and also in the native language. We said that this is very fundamental to the infant's ability to perceive speech and acquire language eventually. In the current lecture, we will begin with discussing the consequences of the same for infants who are bilingual, either in a sequential bilingual sense. For example, they are learning their first language and then after some time the second language comes in, or in a simultaneous bilingual setting where they are exposed to both their languages starting from the birth itself. Let us go ahead. Now, if a bilingual child is introduced to the sounds of a second language at a slightly later age, the ability to perceive phonemic contrasts is already on the wane. It is shifting from more of a language general to a language specific ability with more focus on the contrasts of what it considers the native language. So, basically what will happen is that perceiving the phonemic contrasts of the second language or the third will become as much more difficult the further you take this introduction of the second or third language. So, children have sort of with increasing age are becoming generally less sensitive to the non-native phonemic contrasts, including contrasts that may be meaningful for the second language. So, basically it presents a sort of a challenge given how the organization of phonemic perception is happening within the children, and therefore it will become a bit harder for them to acquire the sounds of the second language the further it happens from the first language. Let's go ahead with that. Now, if children have to, in order for them to learn the sounds of the second language, or say basically, they have it becomes part of their ability to perceive non-native contrast will need to be restored. If they have to acquire these phonemic contrasts from the second or the third language, basically what we will need is we will need a little bit of a reversal of this decline of language general phonemic contrast perceiving ability. And in this instance, de Groot, for example, takes the example of a Japanese born child at 12 months of age who could no longer perceive the difference between the l and r sounds, which are instances of the same phoneme in Japanese, but basically are treated as separate categories in English. So, obviously the later the onset of second language learning will be, it will be that much more difficult for these children to acquire the sounds of a given second or a third language. Now, Cole and colleagues basically examine the conditions which could lead to the reversal of this ability to perceive non-native phonemic contrasts. So, what they did was, in 12 laboratory sessions of around 25 minutes spread across 4 weeks, they exposed a group of 9 and 10-month-old American infants from only English speaking families to Mandarin Chinese. During these sessions, 4 different Mandarin Chinese speakers read children's books to the infants and they played games with them, exposing them to around 25,000 syllables from Mandarin Chinese, whereas for a control group the similar sessions were conducted but by speakers of English. So, here you are saying basically is that you are while not explicitly teaching language to children, you are basically exposing them to the sounds of a different language. These are children who are from only English speaking American families, but what is happening is that during play, during their interaction, they are getting exposed to more than 25,000 syllables which are part of Mandarin Chinese. Now, post training, this ability to perceive contrast in Mandarin Chinese for the two groups was tested using the head turn paradigm. I hope you remember what the head turn paradigm is about. If not, please go and refer to lecture 5 from the first week. Now, as experimental stimuli during test, 2 computer synthesized speech sounds were chosen so that they were contrastive in Mandarin Chinese, but not in English. All right. Now, the results, what did the results show? The results actually showed that infants who were exposed to this interactive sessions of Mandarin Chinese across, the 12 laboratory sessions of 25 minutes each, were able to actually perceive the contrast in Mandarin Chinese almost as well as native Chinese infants. So, you can see here that this is still a very plastic ability. It is still, and because we are talking about these very young infants, it is still an ability that can be restored. The ability to perceive non-native phonemic contrast can still be restored through practice and instruction and interactive games and so on. Now, if you look at these findings from a distance, these findings actually provide support to the notion that the decline in this ability to perceive non-native contrast can obviously be reversed through systematic exposure to that language. So, it is not like if something is lost, at least at this very early age, it is lost permanently. Now, in another similar experiment which exposed children to audiovisual material or just the audio material, actually it was found that the same effect did not happen. So, the same reversal of this ability of perceiving the reversal of this inability of perceiving non-native phonemic contrasts could not be achieved when the interactive sessions were replaced by audio material, let us say just sounds on a recorder were played, or even audio visual material where videos of Chinese speakers were played. So, this is also something very, very interesting that we need to keep in mind, that when we are imparting language lessons to children, or let us say when children are themselves acquiring language, they do so much better in an interactive, true to life kind of scenario rather than picking up language from only audios or only videos. Now, let us look at how this might play out in bilinguals. Okay, and there can be a few questions we can ask about this. For example, what would happen in the case of infants who are exposed to a bilingual environment from birth? What would be considered as the native language? Which contrast the infants will prioritize with the perspective of learning? Now, imagine, say for example, in case of simultaneous bilingual, and as I keep giving the example, suppose a child is born to parents who speak, let's say, English and French. One parent speaks English, the other parent speaks French, and the language environment at home would be constantly of both these languages together. Okay. Now, what would happen in that case? What is the native language here? Which phonemic system will the child prioritize over the other one? And how will they actually learn? Will there be an order of learning here as what happens in the non-native, as what happens in the sequential bilingualism system? So, researchers who were trying to look at these questions focused more on the role of the statistical distribution of the information available to the infants from the two or more languages that are available to them. So, the idea is that these infants are probably paying attention to the statistical properties of the language input, and remember, the language input is mixed. There are both languages which are coming in. So, what the infants are probably doing here is they are paying attention to patterns of speech sounds in when they are being spoken to in English, or when they are being spoken to in French or Chinese or whichever the second language is. Now, for instance, my and colleagues, in 2006, in a study with 6 and 8-month-old infants, actually demonstrated that infants were able to exploit the statistical distribution information or speech sounds from the language input to build these different phonetic categories. More specifically, what they did was that they exposed these infants to either a bimodal distribution, say for example, wherein two types of phonetic categories were equally frequently presented, or a unimodal distributional system wherein, say for example, only one type of phoneme category was presented again and again. And what did they find? They actually find that infants in the former condition were able to develop two distinct phonetic categories, whereas infants in the latter condition, where they were presented only with a unimodal distribution, were able to develop only one prominent category. So, this sort of tells us that language input actually plays a very, very important role when you are talking about how are infants picking up language from their environment. The nature of language input, the regularities in the language input. Although in the previous lecture we were talking about that categorical perception is innate and this is something that we are born with, you can see here this is a very solid example of the fact that although the basic abilities might be innate, the input actually plays a very important role. The statistical properties of the input plays a very important role in how the child, and to what extent, and to what will be the nature of how children will pick up language from their environment. Let's go further. Now, infants who are raised in a simultaneous bilingual environment are actually exposed to two speech sound systems at the same time. Now, these sound systems may either be very similar to each other, or they may differ from each other in a number of different ways. Say, for example, in the carving out of phonemic categories based on voice onset time values, or maybe rhythm, or maybe some other things. So, in that respect, my and colleagues' demonstration that infants are sensitive to statistical distribution of speech sounds from the input may serve as a mechanism. It may be a candidate mechanism for acquiring speech sounds, basically in a way that that becomes the fundamental source of information for children. But in case of simultaneous bilinguals, we can ask this question that, okay, how are children actually doing this? Which speech, which regularities in their input they are actually paying attention to? Are they sort of doing something like they are paying more attention to first English and then their French, or let's say first their L1 and then their L2, or in which order, and how are they actually extracting this information? Because obviously the input is mixed, the statistical patterns are probably too many to decipher from. So, given that the linguistic environment of these simultaneous bilinguals is considerably more complex than of monolinguals or even sequential bilinguals, because in sequential bilinguals also you are exposed to the first language first, and you might be learning aspects of the first language, the second language only comes later. In simultaneous bilinguals, you are having input from both languages at the same time starting from birth, and it becomes that much more difficult for people to sort of or for these infants to maybe acquire these categories from the two languages simultaneously. Are these competing sound systems, or are they very similar sound systems? Both will have their own challenges. So, using the head turn procedure, Bosch and Sebastian Gall actually looked at the development of vowel contrasts in Catalan Spanish infants for two groups of 4 and 8 month olds. So, when I am saying Catalan Spanish infants, we are talking about infants who who are speaking, whose environment consists of both Catalan and Spanish input. And you will see that the choice of age groups is also interesting, because remember, prior to 6.5 months the ability is more language general. So, for one group of infants, which is the 4-month-old infants, it is still that more language general, and for the other group of infants, which is after 7.5 months, which is around 8 months old, it is gradually moving towards more language specific capabilities. So, as a control group, 4 and 6 month old Spanish and Catalan monolingual children were also tested, and the idea was to be able to compare their developmental pace and trajectory with these infants which are 4 and 8 month olds of Catalan Spanish bilingual infants. So, technically what we have here in this experiment, just to sort of recount, is that we have 6 groups. We have Catalan Spanish bilinguals, 4 months and 8 months, so 2 groups here. We have 4-month Spanish monolinguals and 6-month Spanish monolinguals, and we have 4-month Catalan monolinguals and 6-month Catalan monolinguals. So, in all what we have is we have 6 groups of infants which are being sort of compared with each other at each age group. Now, the vowel contrast that the experimenters chose to study was the contrast between A as in bait and A as in bet. Now, this vowel pair is contrastive in Catalan. So, in Catalan, bait A sound or bet A sound is actually different phonemic categories, but not really in Spanish. In Spanish, they basically instantiate the same vowel category and is not really distinguished. So, for example, for Spanish adults, these two will be the same sounds, whereas for Catalan adults, these two will be slightly different sounds. And infants were basically how they were testing is that infants were exposed to different instances of these two sounds embedded in disyllabic non-words. And why are they using non-words? Because A, they are sort of they don't have any other familiarity, clue of familiarity to these children, and they were basically disyllabic non-words, and they were embedded in words and not produced in an isolated fashion, so that things are slightly closer to how these phonemes are actually encountered in natural speech. More specifically, what they did was that during the familiarization, half of the infants in each age group were presented with A as in bait, and half of them were presented with A as in bet. Whereas in the test trials, they were presented with either the same one that were presented in the test in the familiarization phase, or a different sound to that was presented in the familiarization phase. So, the discrimination they have to make, again remember, the head turn procedure is being used, if I am correct, yeah, head turn procedure is being used. They are basically asking them to make these discriminations. And what we are sort of going to see is whether the Catalan Spanish bilinguals make this discrimination well, or whether the Catalan monolinguals obviously should be able to make this discrimination. Spanish monolinguals might not be able to make this discrimination. So, we have these three predictions. Okay. But around 4 months of age, the authors predicted that for at least 4 months of age, all the three groups will be able to perceive this phonemic contrast, because there is this ability, there is this language general ability of perceiving phonemic contrast that is there up till 4 or 5 months of age. However, Spanish infants at 8 months of age might have lost this ability, might have lost this generic ability of making these phonemic contrasts. So, technically they should not be expected to be able to make this difference. Okay. So, by this time they would have lost the ability to perceive these Catalan specific contrasts, since these are not relevant to Spanish. Interestingly, if you look at the possibility for bilingual for these simultaneous bilingual kids, if only continued exposure to both languages is important, they should have developed distinct categories for A, as in bait, and E as in bet, and should be able to perceive the contrast. So, let us see. Alternatively, it could also be possible that due to the distributional overlap between the Catalan A and in bait versus A as in bet, the acoustically intermediate category that happens in Spanish, they could fuse everything together and just come up with a single phonemic category. Let us see what the results tell us. The results actually showed that for all the three groups of 4-month-olds, they were able to perceive the phonemic contrast in A versus A, bait versus bet, which, as we were reasoning, is perfectly plausible. Also, 8-month-old Catalan but not 8-month-old Spanish people could perceive the contrast, which is also perfectly plausible, because we know that 8-month-old Spanish monolingual infants would not be able to do this, because they are sort of moving more towards the language specific phonemic contrast than the language general phonemic contrasts. The interesting pattern of results was found with bilingual infants. The results were interesting because they seem to have lost the ability to perceive this phonemic contrast, and they behaved much like the Spanish monolinguals of the same age. How is this happening? Why is this happening? Will the ability be restored again? Why are they not being able to perceive the phonemic contrasts that are specific to Catalan? Because they are also Catalan Spanish bilinguals eventually. By when would this be restored, if at all? So, to answer this question, they tested another group of slightly older 12-month-old Catalan Spanish simultaneous bilingual infants, and actually found that the ability to perceive phonemic contrasts in Catalan were restored by this age. So, what we are seeing here is, for simultaneous bilinguals, this ability of being able to perceive the contrasts in given language may be slightly delayed. It may take some time for the system to pick up the contrast of one language, and then pick up the contrast of the other language, and then sort of reach some kind of a reconciliation where they are able to keep these two categories separate. What might have happened, and again I am speculating, what might have happened in this earlier age is that they might have sort of fused these categories together, and it is because it is not relevant in Spanish, they are not being able to make these differences. But as they grow older, as they move towards the capability of developing language specific contrasts in Catalan and language specific contrasts in Spanish, they get back this ability to make these distinction between the bait and the bet A sound. This is something very similar to the author's conclusion. So, they said that due to the simultaneous exposure to both languages, Catalan and Spanish, these infants may have initially developed a single phonemic category of these A sounds, and as in bait and bet, and hence initially they failed to distinguish between them. However, gradually as the ability to perceive these contrasts becomes better, they become better in processing language specific input, they get this ability back, albeit with a delay of a few months. So, interesting, because it sort of tells us that how is this mixing of two languages since birth is impacting the development of phonemic perception in these children. Similar demonstrations were also documented in later studies by Bosch and Gauls in 2003 and 2005, and based on these findings it could then be concluded that cross language distribution overlap indeed delays slightly the building of language specific contrastive categories in simultaneous bilinguals. It does not impact it in a sense that they do not have that ability, it just delays it. Basically, you can say that the system is buying time for itself to acquire the language specific phonemic contrast for both of their known languages. Now, an additional interesting proposal was made by Sundara and colleagues in 2008, who proposed that infants are not only sensitive to just the distributional characteristics of the speech sound, but also to the frequency with which these speech sounds occur in these respective languages. And how will they test their hypothesis? So, what they did was they compared the speech perception ability of monolingual French, English and bilingual French English infants, and they basically compared them on their ability to distinguish between the French the and the English de. Now, in French the sound is the, do something or something like that, and whereas in English it is the very specific de. You can also see that in French the is basically pronounced by keeping the tongue just at the back of the teeth, whereas the English de is pronounced by keeping the tongue in the alveolar ridge, in the palatal. So, while the French and English de sounds or the sounds are differently produced, the place of articulation is different, and this difference can be phonemic in some languages, but interestingly what happens in English is that these two sounds instantiate the same phonemic category. So, technically while you are saying the or the de, it is actually instantiating the same phonemic category irrespective of whether it is English or whether it is Dutch, because there is a lot of overlap. Still, when you test, English adults are able to distinguish between the French the and the English de, but French adults are not capable of distinguishing between these two. So, given that these two versions are very frequent in French and English respectively, it could be expected that French English bilingual infants might be expected to follow the same strategy as adults would do. So, basically they should be able to make this distinction as as their monolingual English controls. Now, for the experiment what they did do was they actually had a visual fixation habituation procedure, and 3 groups of 6 to 8 month old infants and 3 groups of 10 to 12 month old infants were tested. During the habituation phase, half of the participants, half of the infants were presented with the French the tokens, and half of them were presented which were produced by French monolingual speakers, and the other half were exposed to the repetitions of English de tokens which were produced by words excised from monolingual English speakers. So, they were basically, half of them were familiarized with the, half of them were familiarized with de, and again we are basically asking them to make the same different decision. The results actually showed that since language specific perception has not really developed by around 6 to 8 months of age, infants from all 3 groups, French monolinguals, English monolinguals and French English bilinguals, were capable to make this distinction between the French the and the English de sound. Interestingly, since language specific perception has started to crystallize by around 10 to 12 months of age, English and French monolinguals actually showed very similar patterns and were not able to perceive the difference. Again, something very interesting as to what we saw in the previous study. Now, for the results of bilinguals to be, these infant simultaneous bilinguals 10 to 12-month olds, if only cross language distributional overlap would determine the time course of phonetic development, these bilinguals should actually fail to perceive the contrast, and they would basically be grouping the instances of French and English the and the together. On the contrary, if frequency really matters, and because in English the is much more frequent than the, these people should follow the example of English adults and be able to distinguish between the and the de sounds. And indeed, this is what happened, because these bilingual kids were actually able to detect the difference, much like English monolingual infants and adults. So, we can see here that not only the statistical distribution, but also the frequency of use of these particular sounds in a given language, and which basically would reflect in the input that they would have received, actually also matters. So, to conclude this, if you consider the joint results of both types of studies, from sequential bilinguals to simultaneous bilinguals, you could basically say that simultaneous bilinguals develop some contrast at the same pace and with the same trajectory as their monolingual peers, although the development of few other contrasts may be slightly delayed, okay, and may follow a different route. Further, both cross language distributional overlap as well as the frequency of occurrence of specific speech sounds in these different languages actually plays a very important role in how these individuals are going to acquire these speech sounds. All right. So, this is all about how these phonemic contrasts are acquired in sequential bilinguals and simultaneous bilinguals, and what are the specific characteristics. In the next lecture, I am going to talk to you more about words and how things are how children start to segment the word stream. Thank you.